So to make some flexible materials, we can just use the natural mycelium sort of membrane properties that occur on top of our substrate. There are many different experimental ways to try this. Definitely encourage you to try a variation of these techniques. And remember that mycelium really likes to grow on lignocellulose, especially if that's the kind of strains that you're using. They're like primary decomposers. So decomposing some of that wood fiber. In this case, this is jute fiber. So this is just an old market bag that we're repurposing and reusing to create a flexible matrix for our mycelium membrane to grow on so that we can separate it from the substrate. Two different versions that we're going to show you here. These are definitely not the only two ways to do this. We've been actually playing around with growing mycelium skin composites onto bacterial cellulose, but this is a little bit more advanced. It has a lot of different parameters that you need to take into account, like various sugars and pH levels. So for this class, we'll just do a very basic introduction to flexible skins and what that can look like. So first, maybe I'll just give you a little look at what some of these materials can look like or can be. In this example, we have just used some Ganoderma, so reishi, mycelium, and some linen fiber. And it's quite thin, so you actually can't really see that it's encompassing all of the linen fiber. If you just like zoom in right in there, maybe you can see that there's like a little bit of fiber coming out of the sides. But yeah, so this has just grown in a disc in a Petri dish. So you can definitely do this in a sterile Petri dish, which will allow you to put this into a pressure cooker if you have. Otherwise, you can also do this in like some Tupperware from home. Another example of what these skins could look like. These are grown in Petri dishes. So as you can see here, we've used this jute material but cut it into a circle prior to putting it into the glass Petri dish. Once you've put this into your glass Petri dish, you can put this you can wet it first because that's the only way that it's going to actually be able to sterilize the material. It needs to be a little bit humid so that it's actually heating up the fibers, and the steam is killing off those microbes and bacteria that are residing in the jute. And yeah, so you would put your disc that you've cut out into the glass Petri dish. Remember not to use any plastic, single-use plastic Petri dishes for this step because they will melt in your pressure cooker. And seal it without putting the parafilm, again, because this will melt in your pressure cooker. And place this Petri dish with the jute before being inoculated into your autoclave or home pressure cooker. You can also place them into one of your unicorn bags. I don't know if you can see it there. So that it protects the Petri dishes from becoming filled with water. And we just allow the steam to circulate inside the bag and sterilize our substrates, which in this case are just one flat piece of textile. We'll put that to the side for now. And I'll show you one other way that you can make some larger skins. So that's one way. What has been done here is actually one piece of your mycelium plate has been cut out and placed face down as if you were doing an agar transfer, but instead you are transferring your mycelium sample or your mycelium culture into this jute disc and letting it grow throughout. So it's gonna grow a little bit different than on an agar plate, but with time, it will completely cover the textile inside of your Petri dish. The only thing is sometimes this takes a bit of time and you can get some contamination. So that's something to be, to be aware of. To use a fast growing strain. Something else that you can do here, and at this point you don't have to be too worried about working under a flame. You can if you want to. It's just good practice, even just to remember about your sterile workflow, especially if this is the first time that you're working with these tools. It's always good practice to continuously do this, even if it's not required. So spray your hands, spray your arms, wear your mask, spray your surface, and heat up your tools, spray your tools. And then working underneath of your sterile space, open up your Petri dish. Taking all of the agar plate out. And then you want to take off all of the agar from underneath. And you can do this either at a sink or you can do it under your sterile workspace. Just make sure that you're not directly working with anything else at the same time, because this is fully open. It's not like you're keeping the best sterile work conditions. So really at this stage, this is not fully necessary. Again, this is just like good practice, but we're going to dry this piece at this point. So really it's as grown as possible. You want a fully grown plate when you do this step. And yeah, take off all of the agar. You can also dry it with the agar on, but I find that if you just want to keep the mycelium skin, you want to remove as much of the agar as you can. At this stage, if you want to keep it flexible, you're going to add a plasticizer before you dehydrate it. This is because this is a very thin sheet of mycelium, and if we dehydrate it on its own without adding a plasticizer, it is going to be very, very hard, and it's going to become very, very rigid and crunchy, almost like paper. Think of a dehydrated mushroom that becomes really dry and crunchy. It's not soft and malleable as a wet, fresh mushroom is. So similar idea. Oh yeah, we just take off all of that agar from our skin, and then we have a mycelial skin. Clean this out. I don't want any like little creatures to be growing in there. And I'm going to allow it to dry. And place a little bit of glycerin. So here I'm using glycerin, vegetable glycerin, and this is a natural byproduct of soap making. And you'll just add a few drops to your skin to keep it from drying out too quickly. You can flip it over and do the same process on the other side. Just make sure that it's fully covered. And that is extended because it will definitely dry onto itself and bind to itself. So just as we can put two pieces of mycelium objects or structures onto each other and they will glue together or bind together, we can actually do the same with our agar plates if we want to make a large skin just by this very easy process. Easy, I say, because it's definitely much easier to grow skins onto Petri dishes because they're so small. The larger the surface area that you're trying to inoculate and fully myceliate, the longer time it's going to take for that plate to colonize or to myceliate, and the longer time that it takes to fully grow, the more chances there are for there to be some contamination or like competing microbes propagating the space. So these are just a few of those plates, same process, just all put together, placed together to dry on top of one another. And as you can see, they've glued together here and we've created a flexible surface. And this one, the skins were all slightly different, at slightly different stages of growth. So it's really interesting that some have like more of the brown enzymes that have started to take over the plate, whereas some are more fresh and they're that more white color of mycelium. They're actually two different stages of decomposition. So the white mycelium is just slightly different metabolites than the brown, which tend to come later as a more kind of resilient skin, resilient membrane. And again, there's another version of that. And as you can tell here, there's a bit of translucency, which is just held together with a bit of that agar because you don't wash it out. There's a little bit that dries on there and allows it to continue to keep flexibility as well. So there's some examples of that. Now I will show you one last way that you could cultivate this membrane or this skin. And that way is by actually using a textile that needs to be natural. So either you're going to use like a bamboo mesh or a jute or hemp mesh. In this case, we're going to use some pieces of a jute bag that we've cut out in the shape of our container. So what we want to do here is actually separate the mycelium skin that naturally grows onto our myceliated substrate from the substrate itself, because you'll notice that this will naturally happen on your substrate. Here's a few examples of what that looks like. And you can see here this this skin, number one, has been dehydrated without using a plasticizer, so it's quite crunchy. It's like a woody piece of paper, like a dehydrated mushroom. And the second thing that you can see is that it's very, very difficult to actually pull off the skin without any of the substrate on it. Oops. So if you are interested in just isolating the membrane, then one way to do that is by using a natural textile. Why a natural textile? Because especially like something like jute or hemp or linen or bamboo, the mycelium will grow into and will be attracted to grow upwards from it. So you'll actually be able to create a nice thick skin on top of that matrix, of that mesh. So you're just kind of giving it some structure and also allowing it to separate from all of the substrate bits that you don't want. Yeah, those are just more examples. I'll kind of look like a piece of steak. And these have been, glycerin has been added to them to just, what glycerin does is it allows some of the humidity content to be retained within the piece itself. So that's why we use that, but there's a plethora of other plasticizers. You can use different waxes like soy wax or beeswax, but those will give you a slightly more rigid finish. So yeah, for more delicate pieces we tend to use glycerin because it's also you can find it very thin, and you can add very thin layers, let that dry. If you still want it to be a bit more flexible, you can add another layer. So it can be an adjustable process. So to make this matrix, we are going to use a rectangular Tupperware of any sort. This is just a little rectangular storage container. And you can also, like I said, use a Petri dish if you have a glass one that you can sterilize. That's perfect because you can sterilize the container and the substrate at the same time, which saves you some potential contamination, and it's also just really efficient because you have to sterilize the substrate regardless of which container you use. We've cut this piece of jute mesh from a market bag, and now we're going to wet it. We're going to use distilled water because that's what we're using here at our studio space. Again, why we wet this before we put it into either a unicorn bag to sterilize, or if you're putting a disc of it directly into a Petri dish, is because it needs a bit of moisture for the humidity. You're basically kind of like slow cooking it, and that's how with high pressure though, and that's how you are able to fully kill the microbes, bacteria, and yeast that are living in here microscopically. So we put this, if you're not putting it into a Petri dish, you will just put it into a sterilizable bag, autoclavable bag. In this case, we just have like the mushroom grow bags or the filter patch bags. Close that up just very loosely to allow some of the steam to go through, and you'll put that into your pressure cooker. Once that's out of the pressure cooker, fast forward, we are going to use some reishi substrate. So this is just some like wood chips, and it has been inoculated from this reishi grain spawn, commercially bought from here, Bolitza Soka. But we went through this process, so we know how to do this. So again, make sure that you just spray yourself with alcohol, your arms. And I'm going to also use a scale because it's good to keep a pretty consistent parameter of the materials that you're using, so you document what the weight of the material was. And of course that's also going to be taking into account the humidity content in here. So we'll open this really close, working in this convection curve of heat, which is allowing us to work without too many microbes falling into our space, and closing the bag as soon as we've gotten our mycelium out is really important. And then we just put that to the side. We're going to pack this down. You might need a little bit more. And as you can see already here, we have a bit of the skin, so we can incorporate that into our mix. So we have about 84 grams, and we could just make that an even 85, taking some really myceliated pieces. Also, I should note that this was like a block before I started using it, so I actually have been massaging it from the outside to break it up so that I don't have to touch it so much here. We want to like minimize the amount of touching that we're doing. And every time that you touch another thing in the lab, just make sure that you spray your hands with 70% alcohol. Also, I should note that at this point, the mycelium that you want to use, the myceliated substrate that you want to use, should be really, really healthy, meaning you've allowed it one incubation period and it's become about 90% white, meaning myceliated, so it's like covered in that mycelium. Then you break it up so that the mycelium enters the inside of the block, because that part normally isn't as eaten up by all the mycelium. So when you break it up, you'll spread some of that hyphae and into the center, into the heart of the block. So you allow it to start to regrow from the inside, which is really, really important to make sure that we're putting only healthy myceliated myceliated substrate into our objects. Wiping your hands. We've sterilized our jute in this filter patch bag. If you can try to reach it by just opening the bag a little bit under this curve, even better. And try not to stick your hand fully in there. Just pull it out and close the bag. I'm working in this sterile workspace using a pair of sterilized tweezers. We're going to make sure that we're covering the whole surface. Maybe, yeah, using your sterilized tweezers to like pat it down. And then you can use some distilled water if you feel like your jute is too dry. It shouldn't be from your sterilization process, but if you let it cool overnight, maybe it's lost some of its humidity. That can happen. So you can use some distilled water from a sterile source. In this case, again, we do it ourselves here at the lab, so we have some distilled water that I'm going to spray the surface with so that I'm attracting my mycelium to a nice moist surface, kind of like when mushrooms start to grow and the soil becomes really humid and the temperature lowers. That's sort of like the perfect incubation period where this mycelium skin is going to start to grow. The nice thing about using Petri dishes, even if they do sell pretty big ones, I can show you an example of a glass one that is pretty large, is that you can skip this you can skip the saran wrap or the plastic wrap So we want to cover it fully. We want to puncture some holes. And we're waiting for the tip to get red hot. That's when we can use this. That's when we know we've sterilized the metal. And just make some little breathing holes. If you're in a pretty sterile space, you can leave this just as is because the holes are pretty micro, but normally, because there's so many kind of competing molds around, in case that you want to be extra safe, you'll just put a tiny bit of micropore tape onto all of those little holes, which allows air exchange, oxygen exchange for the mycelium, but it doesn't allow any microbes or bacteria to fall into the mold. And you do the same thing with the incubation periods. You will put this into your incubation chamber. Oh, sorry, I forgot to label it. I lied. And then you label it. So this was Ganoderma lucidum GL. Sometimes I will put, if there was a company specifically that I got the culture from, in this case we can say BS, Boleta Soca, and we can put the date of today. Whatever that is, it doesn't matter. Perfect. And we'll also write the substrate, in this case jute, cloth, and wood fiber. Do that. And just put that somewhere on your molds and into your incubation chamber for about 2 weeks, and monitor the growth because it may need a little bit more heat. About 24 degrees is perfect for Ganoderma strains, but it depends on what you're using. As a mycelium strain, you may need to check the growth conditions, and you can find all those sources online. Thank you.